Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. Intellectual suicide or inspiration. Actually, there's a popular opinion abroad today that taking any scientific any non-scientific knowledge claims seriously is intellectual suicide. Here's an example of such a belief, the new book by a philosopher called Alex Rosenberg. He has written this book called The Atheist's Guide to Reality, in which he says things like, science provides all the significant truths about reality, and knowing such truths is what real understanding is all about. Or he says, once you adopt science, you'll also be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge. Sorry, this is not what I'm saying, this is what he's saying, okay? And I refer to this kind of language and speech, which is rarely as blunt as Professor Rosenberg puts it, but it appears in many other kinds of writings as scientism. And as Professor spoke to us earlier about, I've written this book called Monopolizing Knowledge, in which I call this belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, scientism. And I became so frustrated with the scientism that is abroad in our society today that I felt I should write a book about it. And I did so, in which I investigate its history and its distinction from science, its justification insofar as there is any, and its cultural consequences. And that's the end of the advert. I was at my son Simon's graduation at Bates College some years ago. Here is Simon graduating from Bates College. Congratulations. And the speaker at that graduation ceremony was Steven Weinberg. Now, Steven Weinberg is a famous physicist, an outstanding Nobel Prize-winning physicist, actually, and a very interesting and thoughtful commentator in the New York Review of Books and so forth. But his message to the undergraduates graduating from Bates College was basically to welcome them to the Enlightenment, to say that your education removes the shackles of superstition, which he considered to all religions simply to be. And he said that religion is medievalism, and his main focus, which is actually usually, which is a change from the usual focus, was actually Islam. You may do the calculation. This was in 2002, so you can imagine why, or I think 2003. So it was in the early 2000s. That's perhaps why his focus was Islam. Now, this is an example of the kind of speech about science which illustrates scientism taking aim against religion. And that's very often what motivates scientism. High-profile atheist scientists like Weinberg and others are representatives of the view that Christianity and science are so incompatible that they must necessarily be at war with one another. And according to their scorecard, Christianity has lost, or actually they would say Christianity has lost the argument, but it refuses to fade away in the way that secular thinkers think that it should. Now, Christian preachers score the war differently. They think that Christianity is on the way to winning. But they still think that there's a war. But the question I want to ask is there inevitably a war? Is this assumption correct, that Christianity and science are so incompatible that a war between them is inevitable or not? And so what I want to talk about today is what is the evidence for this view of the world, this warfare view. I want to look at some of the history and opinions of science and scientists which contradict this warfare assumption. And then I want to ask the question, can religion and science be compatible? Talk about some of the philosophical underpinnings of science, which constitute some limitations to it. And talk about what I think makes much more sense of the world, which is to give due credit to complementary examples and explanations at different levels. And then I'll finish with a few remarks about how can one discover whether Christianity is true. Now, I'm from MIT. MIT is the high temple of science and technology in the US. And as befits a high temple, we have temple architecture, complete with fluted columns of Greek variety. Now, if this were truly a Greek temple, then at the top of the columns, we ought to have bacchanalian friezes with the orgies of the gods. Instead of that, what we have are the names of the great heroes of science and technology over history. And some would say that the drunken orgies take place across the river in the frats. Some time ago, a couple of colleagues of mine on the faculty thought it would be interesting to try to assess how many of these great scientists of history, whose names are represented on MIT's architecture, were actually Christians. Now, of course, this is very hard to assess, and so the result is relatively uncertain. But the answer we came up with is something in the region of 50 to 60% of these people were Christians. And this is the first fact that I'd like to put in front of you in kind of contradiction of the assumption that science and Christianity have always been at war. How could that possibly be the case if so large a fraction of the great scientists of history were in fact Christians? Actually, the Christians of history had a different view of the relationship between science and the Bible. The view that they adopted, for example, someone like Francis Bacon, who is often thought of as being a kind of founder of modern science, although in a certain sense he should be considered the father of the philosophy of science, because he was more of a philosopher-statesman than he was an actual scientist. But he wrote something, for example, like this: "Let no one think or maintain that a person can search too far or be too well studied in either the book of God's word or the book of God's works." In other words, he, like most of the people of his time, regarded God's revelation as coming in two forms. One was the written revelation associated with the scriptures, and one was in nature itself. Isaac Newton, a little bit later in the 17th century, was perhaps the most famous classical scientist of all time, and his Principia made him really a legend even in his own lifetime. He was a person greatly interested in religious matters. In fact, he wrote more words, not published, but more words about the Bible than he did about science. So neither of these people took the view that there was inherently a warfare between science and the Christian faith. The person I like most to adduce in this regard is James Clerk Maxwell, who was the discoverer and formulator of the Maxwell's equations. And if I show this at MIT, I expect everyone to know what this equation means. I'll give you a pass. There won't be any exams later on that. But Maxwell is an interesting contrast because, sometimes the atheist polemicists of today say that people believe religion because they were taught it when they were children and they somehow never shucked it off. Okay? Maxwell was brought up a Christian, but when he was at Cambridge University as an undergraduate, he wrote to his father the following: "Nothing is to be holy ground consecrated to stationary faith, whether positive or negative. All fallow land is to be plowed up. Christianity, that is the religion of the Bible, is the only scheme or form of belief which disavows any possessions on such a tenure," in other words, the holy ground. "Here alone all is free." So in other words, what Maxwell was saying that he was going to do was to examine deeply at a philosophical level his Christian faith and decide on his own ideas whether this was really true or not. And of course, he came to the conclusion that Christianity was true, and it made sense of his life. He was throughout his life a deeply devoted Christian, not a sectarian by any means. He was quite open to the Baptists as well as the Presbyterians and the Anglicans. And the same was true of many scientists of history. So I have also observed, as a matter of personal experience, that if you ask the question about people in the academy today, are they more likely to be a Christian if they're a scientist or if they're someone in the humanities or social studies? Far often it is the case that amongst Christians in the academy, scientists are the most strongly represented. Now, this was anecdotal observations of mine for many years, but then I discovered actually that there's perfectly good sociological evidence for this. Robert Wathnow, who's a Princeton University sociologist, cites this survey data, where you ask if academics in the sciences are actually more often Christians than those in the non-scientific disciplines. So if you ask if they're indifferent to religion or if they don't believe in God, the people who most subscribe to these anti-religious positions are people in sociology or humanities, not the people in the sciences. So this is another example of the fact that, yes, maybe there's unbelief in our academy today, more so than in society at large. But is that because of science? Well, not if it would be the case that it would be science if, in fact, scientists were the least likely to believe, but in fact they proved to be the most likely to believe. And there are more recent studies, by the way, that have been done in great detail by Elaine Eklund. So actually, I don't think it's true that science and faith are inherently at war. And I think you can even make a more positive case for the relationship between science and Christianity. And this has been made in a number of books by people that I've cited down here. And that is that the case is that Christianity served as a kind of fertile or hospitable philosophical environment in which modern science as we know it grew and flourished. So it was actually, the argument goes, the viewpoint and philosophy and theology of the Bible that helped to give modern science its start. And the way this works is, if we read the Bible, we find that the Bible says that the creation is a contingent choice of a free creator. So in other words, God had choices about the way the world should be. Well, now, if you think about it a minute, what that means is you can't find out about the world, you can't do science by simply sitting in an armchair and thinking about it, because you actually have to go out and find out what God has actually done. So this biblical viewpoint was an incentive to experimental and observational science. The Bible teaches that the creation is good, and therefore it's inherently worthy of study. The Bible teaches that the creation is not God; they are not one and the same thing. It's not a situation of pantheism. So if someone goes out to study nature, they're not in danger of violating the divine by doing so. The Bible teaches that there's a certain human authority in respect of creation, that there's a responsibility and stewardship that is put onto humankind, and so that calls for us to understand what it is we're stewards of. And the Bible teaches that human rationality is in some sense that we don't fully understand in the image of God, and that this means that the world is in fact comprehensible. And so this gives us encouragement to the work of science and the hope and expectation that it will be successful. So these are, in a very real sense, theological as well as philosophical encouragements to the work of science. And when mingled with the desire to benefit humankind for the relief of man's estate, as the phrase went, and empowered, for example, by the printing press and so forth, these became the features that helped to give modern science its birth and lead it forward into the successes that it's seen. Now, what do we mean by science? First thing to say is that when I use the word science, what I'm really talking about is natural science. The common meaning of the word science today, which is that it's the natural sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, geology, astronomy, and so on, that has actually a different meaning from what once was meant by the word science. And it's important to recognize what we mean by science and stick to it. Otherwise, we get rather confused. But science has a couple of very important characteristics, which are the ways it goes about finding out the knowledge that it finds. And the first is that science insists upon repeatable experimental tests, or else repeatable observations. So if I do an experiment at a particular time in a particular place, if someone else comes and does a comparable experiment somewhere else at some other time, they're going to get the same answer. That's one of the underlying presumptions and characteristics of modern science. And the second characteristic that I want to draw attention to is a requirement of what I call clarity. That is that the results, although not necessarily the interpretation of experimental tests such as these, have to be consistently agreed upon by observers. And this is one of the things that leads scientists very often to lean upon measurements, because measurements are the thing, or one of the things that has a great deal of clarity. There are other things that also, it's not all mathematics, but it's an insistence upon that clarity. And you can see you've got to have that kind of clarity, otherwise you wouldn't be able to tell whether you're getting reproducible results or not. But these crucial aspects of science's methods involve presuppositions that rule out from science, I would argue, topics that don't lend themselves to these characteristics. And the admitted success of science for many practical purposes doesn't prove that all things in nature are susceptible to these presuppositions. To assume that it does is what I've called scientism. Just to illustrate this question of repeatability, I'd like to draw your attention to Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday is a fascinating character in 19th century science. He had almost no formal education, and yet he rose to be amazingly prolific, and he has no fewer than 5 phenomena or laws of science that are named after him. And he used to say that he had an amazingly fertile imagination, but that imagination had to be constrained by what he called the facts. So he said the facts were important to me and saved me, or he explained it later, without experiment, I am nothing. And when Faraday heard of some new phenomenon or result that had been reported in those heady days of the discovery of electricity and magnetism and its phenomena, it was said that the first thing he would do is he would go down to his lab in the Royal Institution in London and try to reproduce those experiments in his lab. And I like to think of this woodcut as representing Michael Faraday down in his lab in the Royal Institution, trying to reproduce some experiment that he's heard about or read about. So did that make Faraday, that insistence upon reproducible experiments, did that make Faraday into some kind of arch skeptic? No, he was a lifelong Christian. He was a member of the Sandemanian church, a nonconformist church, and in fact he was the elder, which for that church meant the minister or pastor of that church for significant fractions of his adult life. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. It was a personal example of the importance of reproducibility, okay? Now, scientism says that all real knowledge is science. Scientism is not a finding of science. It's a philosophical belief that is independent of science, and I would say it's a philosophical belief that is untrue. And I say instead that science has these distinctive characteristics which limit its applicability. Many disciplines cannot be considered to be sciences in the way that the natural sciences are. So, for example, history can't be a science because it deals with the unique events of the past very often. In fact, it's often the unique events that are the most interesting. Of course, history deals with everyday events as well, but the whole point is you can't do a repeatable experiment in history in order to find out what is true and what is false. Similarly, the arts can't be sciences because they cannot be understood to have the kind of clarity that is important for science. They can't be understood in this kind of reductionist or simply measurement type of mentality. The humanities can't be sciences, I would say, because science rules out personality from the beginning, and I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. The law, jurisprudence. Jurisprudence can't be like science because for one thing, you can't put off the verdict. You have to arrive at some verdict, guilty or not guilty, on the basis of just the influence and evidence that you have. You can't go back and do reproducible tests. You have to take into account just what is known of the phenomena at hand. And of course, interpersonal acquaintance, like most personal knowledge, cannot be conducted on the basis of science. It possesses neither repeatability or clarity. And you better not, try to do scientific experiments on your friends to find out whether they're really your friends or not, because they won't be. So there are many topics, I say, in life, very important topics, that simply can't be approached in the way that the sciences approach their knowledge. And I would simply say that religious faith is one of them, because it can't be subject to tests that have these features of reproducibility and clarity. Now, I like to use this quote from Nobel Prize-winning author Jacques Monod. He won the Nobel Prize in the 1960s or 70s for medicine. He wrote this book called Chance and Necessity. And in it he wrote, "The cornerstone of the scientific method is the postulate that nature is objective." In other words, the systematic denial that true knowledge can be got at by interpreting phenomena in terms of final causes, that is to say, of purpose. Now, I like this quote for two reasons. First of all, it's a classic example of scientism, surreptitious or just presupposed scientism. Because what you see happens is Monod starts off talking about the scientific method, but one sentence later he's talking about true knowledge. So inherent in the way he's thinking is that all true knowledge is science, is got at by the scientific method. So this is an example of scientism by stealth in popular writing. But I like this quote also because actually I think it's largely correct about its characterization of science. It's true that science does proceed by, in a certain sense, a denial that it can be scientific to interpret phenomena in terms of final causes. There is a sense in which science really does rule out from the get-go purpose and personality for that matter. And so I think, in a certain sense, he has it right, but he also has interpreted science as being all of true knowledge, which is really a step towards scientism. But it's not the case that once there is a scientific explanation of something, any other explanation is ruled out. I don't think there ever is going to be, in a certain sense, a full scientific explanation of personality or purpose, for the very good reason that personality and purpose and agents are essentially ruled out of the considerations that science is fundamentally equipped to understand. And yet, the fact that science doesn't find personality and purpose in the world is not an indication that there is no personality or purpose in the world. It's just an indication that there are limitations to what science can actually detect and analyze. And the reason why personality and purpose are ruled out by science is fundamentally because they're higher level concepts. I say that there are different ways of approaching the world. There are different levels of knowledge. There are different levels of description. And that each of those levels may have additional facets of the truth, of reality, to contribute to our understanding. But when you're talking about personality and purpose, you can only understand personality and purpose in terms of a holistic view of the entire creature. So my finger doesn't have a purpose except insofar, as I might want it to do something. So the purpose of my finger, in the sense of what my finger intends to accomplish, is something that can only be understood at a higher level of understanding, not reduced down into an understanding in terms of molecules or atoms. Now, I'm going to try to do this little demonstration to illustrate the idea that there can be different descriptions at different levels. So with luck, this will work, but it's always a little bit nerve-wracking at this point. Let's give it a try. What I want to show you is some music. I'm going to show you this music, and I'm going to say this is an illustration of a scientific description of music. So we all know that music can be digitized, that music is sound and it's compressional waves in the air. It can be digitized and put onto a CD or onto the hard disk of this computer. And so in a certain sense, this is a scientific description of music. Great, isn't it? No, you don't kind of get it, do you, when you just see it up there like that? And so this is a way of saying that the scientific description of music, interesting and in a certain sense accurate though it may be, hardly describes the whole thing. So can anyone tell me what this music is? I mean, some would say that's a little unfair, Ian, because actually our ears process things by a frequency analysis. So I can show you a frequency analysis if you like. Does that help? No, of course it doesn't. So you can't tell what that music is until I turn up the sound. And then you find that it's actually a very complex and interesting piece of music. And it has words and has lots of other things. And in fact, it's Bach's Christmas Oratorio. I'll turn the sound down because otherwise I'll have to compete with it. So what I'm trying to say is that music is an example of something that has to be understood at a higher level if we're to make any sense of it than simply the pressure waves of the scientific description or the digitized sound, accurate though that might be. Okay, so the problem with scientism and its influence on our understanding of science is that scientism says there's no real knowledge other than what science gives us. Scientism extrapolates the methods of science, which tend to be reductionistic, tend to be analytic. That science tries to understand things at a deep, low level, which is perfectly valid and appropriate thing to do. But then scientism takes that and extrapolates it into saying that once we have some kind of low-level description of the phenomenon, whether it's digitized music or whatever it might be, that somehow that explains away all of the ways in which we might understand that phenomenon at higher levels. And I think that's simply false. So I would say about a human person that I, for example, am in a certain sense just quarks and electrons. I am quarks and electrons. I am, if you like, a heterogeneous mixture of water and compounds of carbon and oxygen and calcium and so forth. I am a self-regulating biochemical factory. I am an animal, we're a mammal actually. I am a person with human characteristics, understanding, love, desire, and so forth. And perhaps also I am an immortal spirit loved by God. And I would argue that no one of those levels rules out the other ones, even if we take the view that it is true. Now, you might say, well, okay, this is, a Christian trying to make sense of their science, so they're coming up with an excuse, okay, that this is a kind of new idea that people bring along to try to make sense of science. It's not so. This has been, this idea that we must understand the world at different levels has been part of the Christian faith since the get-go. So to illustrate this, think about what Jesus said. Jesus was talking to his disciples about worry. And he drew their attention to the birds of the air. And he talked about how the birds get food to eat even though they don't sow or reap. And yet your heavenly Father feeds them, Jesus said. Or the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And he said, if God so clothes the grass of the field, will he not much more clothe you? Now, just think about this for a moment. What Jesus is saying is, and this is the whole point of the parable, because Jesus is trying to point out these are the most natural things in the world. That birds will find food, that lilies will grow and be beautiful. Okay, these are the most natural things in the world. But at the same time, Jesus is saying that he's attributing their success or their existence even to the Heavenly Father. So he's saying, yes, there is in a certain sense a scientific, a natural explanation for the lilies of the field or the birds of the air. But at the same time, God's hand is at work. So it's been a characteristic of religious language, and indeed of all language, right from the beginning, that we have interpreted things which have a perfectly good scientific explanation also as being significant in other ways, and in this case, the example is of God's hand at work, as Jesus says it. Now, scientism, which denies that possibility that there would be a higher meaning, which says it's the only real knowledge there is science, is a viewpoint which is extremely widespread in the academy and in society as a whole, and I won't give examples of this. But you might ask the question, well, when did this really get going? Actually, scientism, as far as its dominance in the academy is concerned, really got going in the 19th century. And one of its champions was this gentleman here called Andrew Dixon White. What was going on in the 19th century was a lot of arguing and struggling between people who were trying to preserve a tradition of religious emphasis and actually control in the academy, and those who wanted to see a secularized educational system, higher educational system. And White was one of the latter type, and with Ezra Cornell, he was co-founder of Cornell University, and White was the first president of Cornell University. And throughout the 1860s onwards, White wrote a series of pamphlets in which he was basically trying to argue that for hundreds of years, sectarian Christianity had held up, had slowed down the development of science and served as a stumbling block to true human knowledge. And the book that he eventually published, which was called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, was a kind of compendium of all the things that he'd been developing over that time. But it was part of a conscious campaign by a certain faction of the intellectual community to overthrow the Christian hegemony in education. And so that's really when scientism took over as the kind of default position, I would argue, in the academy. Now, I've argued that Christianity is actually not in conflict or in warfare with science. But Christianity is, I think, inherently at odds with scientism. Or scientism is at odds with Christianity. But scientism is actually also at odds with a lot of other intellectual disciplines. In a certain sense, it's at odds with all of the intellectual disciplines that aren't actually sciences, because it's making these excessive monopolistic claims. But scientism isn't science. Most of the arguments, I would argue, between Christianity and scientists are not at root about science, but they're about scientism. These are sometimes accidentally, but often deliberately confused with one another by scientism's advocates. They're also, unfortunately, often confused with one another by Christian speakers and religious thinkers, because they don't draw a distinction between these two things. Scientism is, in a certain sense, an all-encompassing worldview. Practically speaking, it's a religion. I haven't got time to show this to you, but it has a justifying narrative history. Andrew Dixon White is part of that. His book is part of that. It has an integrating cosmology. It acts as an interpretive lens or filter which kind of colors everything that you see in the world. You interpret it through that lens. It has a community of believers, and it's looked to as a source of ethics. If you'd like to summarize it, it's a unifying vision of the world based on an unproven or distinct commitment which serves to guide morals and values. Well, that, to me, is the definition of a religion. It's certainly a worldview. But if scientism is essentially a religious commitment, why would it be accorded any special academic or intellectual status? Well, postmodernism says it shouldn't, that it shouldn't be accorded any special status. It says that we should reject that scientific hegemony. And I would argue that postmodernism, which those of you in the humanities know what I'm talking about, is in a certain sense a very natural reaction against an unjustified scientism. The difficulty with much postmodern writing, though, is that it tends to throw out the baby, science, with the bathwater, scientism, because they don't draw the distinction. And that's one of its problems. But I think it's a fully understandable reaction. Well, I'm going to wrap up and come to my final point, and then I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope we'll have some good questions from the audience. I'm sure we shall. But I promised you that I'd say a few words about, well, if Christianity isn't a science, okay, and therefore isn't susceptible to scientific demonstration, proof or disproof, well, how do we go about telling whether Christianity is true or false? And I would say, well, you go about it in the same way that you go about deciding anything that isn't a science. You use your intellect to begin with, and then you use many of the tools which are commonplace in the intellectual disciplines that are not sciences, and you also use your practical knowledge and your practical wisdom. So use your intelligence. Use the primary documents, for example. The New Testament is, after all, a set of very important documents about Christianity. When you approach those documents, though, you shouldn't, in my view, approach them with presuppositions that have already essentially imposed a certain answer on it. So if you come to the New Testament with a belief that miracles simply don't happen, then you're going to deduce something about your reading in the New Testament that would be different from someone who didn't hold that presupposition. I would say, actually, this cuts both ways. Sometimes the New Testament and the Bible in general is talked about as if you had to believe that the Bible is, inerrant and inspired by God before you can get anything out of it. I don't think that's true. I think if you're a Christian, you do believe that the Scriptures are authoritative for you. And that authority resides predominantly in Jesus Christ. But if you're not a Christian, I would say come to the Bible with an open mind. Read it. See what it says. I would also say focus on Jesus Christ. Christianity, after all, is about him. What sort of a person was he? Was he, in fact, a historical figure? Some of the militant atheists of today would say he wasn't. This seems completely folly to me, but anyway, was he a historical figure? Are the main texts that we have about him reliable, or are they so distorted by corruption over the centuries that they're no longer reliable? It's a reasonable question. What sort of life was Jesus' life? In particular, what were his teachings like? What were those actually teachings about? They were rather peculiar teachings because they were focused on himself, which has certain implications. And ultimately, the Christians point to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? And that's the question we really have to answer. What's the evidence? And we would have to look at circumstantial evidence. We'd have to look at documentary evidence. There might even be scientific evidence, although it's unlikely to be very much in these very ancient questions. Logical analysis, testimony, and so forth. And I would say the kind of way to approach this question, is Christianity true, is to ask the sort of question is, if there were such a God and a Savior, as Christians claim there is, so engaged with his creation as to desire a personal involvement with his creatures, how would one discover that? Would one discover that by science, or would one discover it in a different way? I suggest to you that you wouldn't expect to discover that by science, any more than you'd try to discover whether your wife loved you by some kind of scientific experiment, okay? No, you would be open to, and you would seek the relationship. And I suggest to you that that is the way that we should approach the question of, is Christianity true, and discover the truths of, or otherwise, of that. So Christians say, and I say, that we have discovered a relationship with God through Jesus that is real. It's not scientific any more than my relationship with my wife is scientific. But there is serious evidence for its reality. It's personal, but it's not just individual. There's an intellectual coherence and explanatory power to it. But like every other relationship, it doesn't just go on with no attention. It requires a level of commitment. And that, I submit to you, is what Christians mean by faith. Thank you very much.
So I have a couple of questions for Dr. Hutchinson, and I hope that they will stimulate some questions, and I'm sure you have many of your own as well. Let me just tell you that on this page that I have here with a bunch of arrows and numbers, if I can keep track of what my train of thought was, that by the time I come to the end of the pathway here, I'm going to be asking him about miracles. And certainly within the context of Christianity, the miracles, as I understand them, the important ones, and he can correct me because, as I said, I'm not a Christian, but that they are in the sphere of biology, that they are things that have supposed to have happened that are of a biological nature, and so they're particularly interesting to me. So I will get around to those, but let me work my way there.
So you've pointed to the booby traps already, right?
Well, I'll probably fall into them. You've set me up here, I'm sure. Right. So first off, may I call you Ian?
Yes, please.
Okay,
That'd be much less embarrassing.
Fewer syllables for me to trip over. So Ian talked about science in terms of characteristics that he associates with it, which were clarity and reproducibility. And I would like to offer a complementary, I think, definition of science, and then maybe a complementary definition of scientism. Be interested if you agree with it. But the definition of science that I've used in my teaching, and I found this in a physics book somewhere.
Must be right, then.
It must be right. And I neglected to get the author's name, so I apologize if the author is in the room. But basically, this definition was, in terms of the goals of science, that the goals of science are to describe, to explain, to predict, and to control the natural world. So describe, explain, predict, and control the natural world. And so there's a lot of key words in there. And perhaps the key one that I want to focus on is the word natural. And you've used it in your book. You didn't use it as much tonight as I thought you might, but I think I'd like to get your take on it. So when we think about what is the natural world, first, that implies that there must be maybe some other kind of world. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the word natural world. And so my view of what that means is the natural world is the world that we can perceive through our senses. And as scientists, we also examine it with instruments that we perceive through our senses. And that we are using those forms of observation to describe those things in the world that are orderly and lawful, that fall into categories, that have reproducibility, and that have clarity. And so this idea of natural, then, leads to a slightly different definition of the word scientism. Ian had described scientism as the assertion that the only knowledge or the only good knowledge is science or scientific knowledge. And I'd like to suggest another one and get your thought about this, Ian, is that scientism asserts that the only reality is the natural world. And that is, in fact, why the only good knowledge is scientific knowledge, because the methods of science are the best methods to understand, describe, and explain the natural world. So I would ask you that question. Would you subscribe to the idea that scientism is actually claiming that the only reality is that of the natural world? Or maybe you think that is the only reality.
Well, okay, so yeah, okay, I understand the question, and I don't really agree with it for the following reason. Okay, first of all, I think it's a reasonable attempt to, and it's not something that I would sort of say is dead wrong, but here's the problem with that approach to defining science. The question is, what is nature? And the difficulty is that nature is a very ill-defined concept. It simply isn't the case that we know what exactly we mean by nature straight away. Back in the 17th century, Robert Boyle, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society, wrote a whole book that was an investigation into the vulgarly received notion of nature. And he pointed out that there were many, many different meanings to the word nature. And actually, part of his book, the purpose of his book was to advocate the meaning of nature, that it was the settled course of events, which is more or less, I think, what you were saying. So the difficulty with defining science as the study of nature, with all the qualifications that you said, is that nature isn't well defined. So my strategy instead is to say that actually, instead of doing it that way around, we define nature as what science studies. Nature is what we study when we're going after the reproducible, orderly aspects of the world that we can discover using the characteristic methods of science. So rather than saying that science is the study of nature, I say nature is what science studies. So that's sort of the difference between us, I think. I mean, maybe it's a subtle difference, but I actually think that the functional definition is a more useful one and a more definite one than trying to define science. So instead of trying to define science in terms of its topic, I think it's better to define science in terms of its methods. And that's where we would perhaps disagree. But I think the spirit of it, is, I think, I appreciate. Okay.
Well, it sounds to me like a bit of two sides of the same coin, where science is well equipped to study what it studies. But
oh yeah, it's absolutely a circular problem. Okay, I mean, science is a study of nature, and nature is what studies science. Is a circular problem. But you're stuck with that circular problem. You've got to break into that circular problem somewhere. Okay, and I assert that the way to break into that circle of unknowns of definition, it's probably better to break in and point to the methods, because those are more easily defined than it is to break into the topic, because actually the topic of nature is not very well defined.
Well, let me go where I was going to go with this and see if I can get anywhere close to a consensus up here with us. So part of my thinking on this has definitely been influenced by having read the book. So it's not just coming from the talk. But sticking with the concept of scientism that I stated, that the only reality is the natural world, then I have tentatively concluded, at least, that one thing you and I have in common, and perhaps the reason that we reject scientism, and in your case, with sufficient motivation to write a book about it and tell why you reject it, is that in doing so we are rejecting the belief, or we are rejecting it because of our belief that there is something real other than the natural world that science studies.
Yes. In short, yes.
Ah. Okay. All right then. So we can go on from there then.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, God, in your book, you've characterized as the author of the natural laws that science, and particularly physics and chemistry, perhaps, seek to discover. Am I correct, basically, in that?
Yeah, and perhaps I should develop this a little bit more. And I'll do so kind of addressing the booby trap that you set for me later, if you like. Maybe bringing it up front will help us to get started on things. I mean, I'm often asked by people who are skeptical of miracles, well, if God is actually active in the world, how could that possibly be? How is it that God really can influence things when we have the laws of physics going on all the time? And the way I like to answer that is the following: is to say that I think that question springs from a kind of presumption that I don't share. It springs from a presumption that the laws of nature, the laws of physics, let me just call them the laws of physics, and I don't mean to be just a boastful physicist now. I mean, because that includes biology. Okay, the laws of the laws of physics in the Christian conception, the laws of physics are a description of the way that God upholds the world in an orderly fashion. So, in the first chapter of Hebrews, it says He upholds the universe by His word of power. So far from the universe being this clockwork or law-like mechanical object that God has somehow set going with these laws of physics to govern it, and then God has gone on vacation, or maybe He's allowed Himself the occasional option of reaching in and tweaking it. I don't think that's a Christian conception of the relationship between God and the universe. I think God upholds the universe by His word of power. I think that at every instant God is sustaining the universe. But He does so in an amazingly faithful and a law-like way. And this is the way Christians over history have tended to think about the laws of nature. It isn't simply that law is a convenient word to describe, when we write down Maxwell's equations. People like Maxwell and Faraday and people before him were thinking, actually to some extent explicitly, that these were laws that were given by a lawgiver, and that God was, in a certain sense, a judicial lawgiver, and that the laws of nature are God's laws. So, so coming back to the question of miracles, if I'm not going on too long, to me, it's not incredible that if God's sustaining the universe in this law-like fashion, that He would consider Himself to have the liberty to do something different from time to time that is not in accordance with the laws that He's given that govern the normal course of events. So to me, it isn't amazing or incredible that there would be miracles. Of course, miracles very often are different from the usual course of events and appear, in that sense, to violate the laws of nature. Okay, But I don't think that in a deep sense they violate the nature of the universe, conceived from a Christian perspective.
Do you think that God has performed enough miracles that it creates any kind of a problem for the scientific enterprise, especially in relation to trying to retrodict and reconstruct the past based on the assumption that everything has played out in a lawful and orderly way?
Right. So clearly science, as its principle, tries to explain all the phenomena that it sees in terms of the laws we've developed that govern the way the universe usually proceeds and the ways in which it proceeds in a reproducible way. But it's quite interesting that though physics has from the 17th century onwards insisted upon trying to find deterministic laws that govern the way the universe usually behaves, what actually it has found in the 20th century is that requirement or that objective of describing all of what happens in nature in this deterministic way has fundamentally failed. And so quantum mechanics, I would argue, is an area where this desire for the definite, reproducible, mathematically described description of nature seems to have come across a block where fundamentally things in science, some things, are statistical in nature. They are not predictable in nature. And so despite its attempt to describe the world to the extent to which it is reproducible and orderly, science has found that the universe is in a certain sense not orderly. There are things that happen, like radioactive decay, that we can't predict. So I think there are hints, even in science, that science is objective, laudable though I think it is, and important though it is, which is to describe the universe insofar as it's reproducible, cannot be applied to absolutely everything, even those things that many people will just say are nature, okay? And when it comes to other things like human intelligence and so forth, I think that's doubly true.
I'll come to my last question and give the rest of you a turn. And it is still on the topic of miracles, so I'd like to be a little bit specific. And so I'm thinking of three particular incidents as described in the Bible. One is the origin of Eve, which, at least according to my childhood memories, is that Eve was created by God from Adam's rib. Now, I don't know if that's a misreading of the Bible or not. It's not? Good. And of course, it's interesting that God would choose to create Eve in that particular way. In trying to think of, is that miraculous? From the perspective of a biologist, it's not, right now we do not have the knowledge or ability to create a woman from a man's rib. And at that early stage, if it did happen, it is unlikely to have happened in a way that we can understand naturalistically, that it would seemingly have to be understood as a miraculous occurrence. The second one is the virgin birth of Jesus. And here we can think about, from a biological perspective, that there is a process called parthenogenesis where some females can produce offspring without the benefit of fertilization of an egg. But it would be very, very difficult for a female human through that process to produce a male offspring through a naturalistic process, because where would the precious Y chromosome come from? Now, we can imagine producing a female from a male, because the male has all the genetic material it needs to produce a female. We just have to get those two X chromosomes going there. But to get a male from a female without a father, again, seems to demand miraculous kind of a mechanism. And then the final one, of course, is probably the most important, and that is the resurrection. And certainly from everything in biology that we currently know today, we have no idea how to make a transformation from non-living to living. And so if something is truly dead, then for it to transition back to living seems a non-natural transition. And so again, I think we're needing to invoke a miraculous explanation. And so I'm sensing that you don't disagree with my characterization of those three events as miracles. And so I'd just like to, my final question then is, as a biologist, and I think as scientists in general, we come to science because we are filled with curiosity and we're analytical and we want to know how things work. Whatever they are, we want to know how they work. And so I'm just wondering, for these things that you accept as miraculous as a Christian, do you as a scientist, or even as that very inquisitive person who was at one point neither a scientist nor a Christian, do you have a desire to know how these miracles work? In other words, if you could have been there with that video camera that could film things right down to the level of the interior of a cell, what might you have seen? Can Christianity, can you construct a story of the type that evolutionary biology can construct about how things might have happened, could have happened, to fill in a mechanism for these events? Or is it simply sufficient to say God works in mysterious ways and let it go at that? So that is my final question, unless you provoke me.
Okay, so, we're still on the miracles track. It's remarkable, that one characterization of miracles is that miracles are more, some people imply that miracles are more difficult to believe now than they once were. And the implication, is founded on a belief that somehow we inherently know more than, people in the first century. In the sciences, that's true. We do know a lot more science than people knew in the first century. But, people in the first century, they knew that people don't come back from the dead, okay? I mean, that was not news to them, okay? They knew, that women don't have babies without you-know-what, So in a certain sense, the issues associated with the miraculous have changed far less, I think, than often people think that they have. I don't think that the Bible was ever intended to be, or is, a science book. And I think one of the grave difficulties with understanding the Scripture arises from treating it as if it were a science book. And so I don't think the Bible tells us, in detail how the resurrection occurred, how the virgin birth occurred, or anything else for that matter, in any kind of scientific terminology. If you ask me, of course I'm going to say, I don't know the answer, okay? Because I'd be foolish to say anything else, because of course I don't know the answer as to how the resurrection took place. In my view, you're quite right, the resurrection must have been, in a certain sense, a violation of the laws of nature, although, as I already explained, that's perhaps in a sort of a distorted way of thinking about it, because the laws of nature are not, in my view, inviolate. They are a description of the way that God upholds in a normal, faithful way, and God is at liberty to make things different if he wishes. If you want me to give you a scientific description of how the resurrection took place, I can't do it, okay? And you asked whether I'm ever curious about that, okay? Yeah, I am sort of curious. I mean, I sometimes do think, well, how did that water become wine? Or how did, the virgin birth take place? Or any other of the miracles that Christians attribute to Jesus, healings and so on and so forth. I think it's interesting to ask those questions, but I would say fundamentally a miracle is beyond the testing and perhaps therefore beyond the descriptions of science. I think it's actually a mistake to think you can prove scientifically that something is a miracle. Because if a miracle is something that's inherently happens only once, it's a unique event, certainly that is the Christian perspective of what a miracle is. It's some unique work of God which is, whose purpose is to show God's care or concern or will, then it's inherently not going to be something you can test or investigate scientifically, because it's not going to be a reproducible event of nature. And so I think we're inherently kind of stuck with the fact that science can't prove miracles. Science may well, on occasions, be able to, in a certain sense, disprove claimed miracles. You know, if someone founds their religious claims on the fact that they can routinely levitate, then science might well, say, hey, well, let's investigate this. And if they were to find, an incredibly strong electromagnet in the basement of this person's house, that might be a strong, suggestion or a scientific disproof of the miracle of levitation. But there is a sense in which science can't, in a meaningful sense, prove a miracle, and miracles have to be approached in ways that are fundamentally not just science. So I've talked around your question. I try to give you an answer. That's about what I can do. I think we should get them to get some questions.
I think so too.
I was curious, as far as you had talked about the statistical nature of some science, and I was curious if you could talk more about, say, fluids and chaotic motion, and how, in one sense, God governs the universe with equations, but then there's this sort of randomness.
Okay. So I think what is being alluded to here is that in the 20th century, what even classical physics underwent a kind of transformation when we realized that determinism probably isn't even a reality for classical physics, quite as apart from quantum physics. So the basic idea was, that Laplace came up, is most famously, thought of as speaking to Napoleon Bonaparte, and talks about how if the equations of classical physics are known, and I know all of the initial conditions, then I can predict all of the future. And it's essentially deterministic. And Napoleon says, well, where's the place for God in this? And I think what we discovered and what has been re-emphasized, let's say, in the 20th century, is even in classical equations, which are in a certain sense deterministic equations, there are certain types of nonlinear equations where the results are so sensitive to the initial conditions that for all practical purposes, we cannot, in fact, predict the outcome. And so even in classical physics these days, there's a recognition that really we don't operate in a deterministic universe. So I would say that this is an example where science has set out down what has been seeking a deterministic description of the world, and has failed to do so. Probably that's as much as I should say on that. Thank you for the question.
As a quick follow-up there, Einstein is famous for saying God does not play dice. Does he?
Yeah, Einstein was famous for saying that, and I think he was wrong, actually. Not necessarily about the dice, but the point of he could not reconcile himself to the quantum understanding of the universe and the possibility that there were not essentially deterministic equations that governed physics. And that's what he meant when he said God doesn't play dice. But I would say the modern understanding of physics is largely that philosophical opinion of Einstein's is probably one of his mistakes.
Up there with the microphone.
Sure. Kind of going back to what you were saying about miracles and there being a God that holds the universe in his hands. it sounds like despite the shortcomings of the scientific method, something that still seems to be relevant across the board is rational thought. And I was wondering, what is the compelling reason to believe that there is that God and that he is, in fact, holding the universe in his hand?
Okay, thank you. Yes. Well, I don't know that there's one compelling reason. I think there are many compelling reasons. And I think that many of these are perfectly rational reasons. And so, I alluded to the resurrection, which I think is one of the evidences that Jesus is who he said he was. And I think there is rational evidence for the resurrection. I don't think it's so overwhelming that no one could doubt it, okay? And I don't think that that level of proof is something that you can require of these types of questions. But I think that's an example of evidence that Christians would put forward for the importance of the person of Christ. There are other philosophical types of argument which talk about, which are famous from the works of people like Thomas Aquinas and so forth, and put forward philosophical reasons. I think one, for example, that appeals to me is, the unreasonable reasonableness of creation. I mean, why is it that mathematics seems to describe the universe so amazingly well? And many physicists and others have been struck by this. I don't mean Christians. I mean, people of all religious beliefs and none have remarked on the fact that we can seem to be able to understand the world in a remarkably well through the mathematics. And so it's fundamentally a question: why should the universe be comprehensible? From the Christian perspective, the universe is comprehensible because it's put in place by a personal, a thinking, an intelligent God. Is that a knockdown proof of the existence of God? No, it's not. But it's an example of evidence. So, when people talk about a distinction between rational evidence and what religious believers do, which they usually call faith, or sometimes they call us faith heads or something like that, I resist that distinction. I think there are good reasons for the faith that I hold. They're not, overwhelming knockdown reasons. But we, in our lives, never have complete information, never have complete evidence, essentially, for any of the decisions that we make. Every day we're making decisions on insufficient or incomplete evidence. And so we have to make those types of decisions. And I would say that faith, to bring it back to the question of faith, faith is, in the first instance, it's making a decision on the basis of perhaps incomplete evidence because we have to. And it's getting up and going. It's committing yourself to something, even though you aren't absolutely sure this is the right path, and so on and so forth. So that was a great question. Sorry, I went on too long.
There was another one along the aisle here. Did that we're done with that one?
We have one.
Oh, we have one over here. Okay.
Okay. So, well, you start this talk with a war, this war between science and religion, and what really came to mind was that if we think about science as debate, like that is the underlying thing that it is, and then religion is more acceptance. But what if it's actually humans have a right and left brain? The right brain being this kind of more emotionally less logical part of our brain, and then the left brain is our logical understanding, of the world. That is both of these hemispheres are necessary for our interaction with the world. And while we keep them separate, but they're also fundamentally incredibly connected, and that maybe we could alter how we think of this. Instead of being a war, is that merely I want to say a personification, but like a manifestation of our very humanity, our very how we were formed and our understanding of the world.
Maybe. I would say probably I'm by nature a left brain kind of guy. But thankfully, and I'm grateful for this, I've had experiences in my life that have led me to believe that there's much else beyond that kind of hard-nosed, logical discussion. So, when I'm in the lab, I want to know the logical reasons for things, and that's very, very important. But there are things in our lives that we can't understand or analyze on that basis. And so, occasionally I guess my wife sees a glimmer of hope when she says, maybe she sees that I putting my right brain into function occasionally. The warfare I alluded to is really a pretended warfare. There is a big argument. There is a big argument, I think, between Christianity and scientism. I think there isn't such a big argument between science and Christianity, although a lot of people kind of feed that by confusing scientism with science. And so I'm on your side. I want to advocate that there are lots of different ways of approaching our knowledge. And I completely want to advocate that and argue that that's the right way to go about things.
Who's got the microphone? Where's the other microphone?
Hi, Professor Hutchinson. I had two questions. The first being, you sort of talked about this a second ago, that and your sort of justification for Christianity was that sort of a wonderment with the whole, you sort of see wonder in the world, and that sort of justifies Christianity for you. But that argument can also be used for nearly any religion you can think of, including this flying spaghetti monster or any other religion. The second question I have is the sort of scientism idea that you sort of get to. Scientism, you seem to claim, is sort of an outgrowth of science, that sort of tumor that's growing on top of science, that's sort of become this thing that's sort of going out of its normal home, or out of its domain into some other domain, which is the religious domain. And you sort of
No,
try
it's
to
not just the religious domain, it's every other non-scientific discipline. That's what I'm arguing.
Sure. So non-scientific domain. And in that sense, there's also sort of the contrast to that, which is that religion is certainly going into the domain of science. And that's sort of this is sort of the question. It's a little bit pointed, but in what ways has religion sort of become, and this is, of course, the case throughout history, that religion is sort of coming into the science field and saying this is how you should do science. And I can think of two examples. One is that is the story of Galileo, and the second example is a more recent one, which is that of stem cell research. This is religious groups that are coming into the science field, making it hard to do science, because they have some preconceived notion that the zygote is somehow alive, and this is preventing science from moving forward. And in that sense, I think religion really is, and this has been the case throughout history, that religion really is overstepping its boundaries. It's been doing it far longer than science. In that sense, religion has sort of been the start of this war that you claim doesn't exist, but it's maybe not a war, but more of a rational argument.
Okay.
Yep.
Say one thing in response before you. I just wanted to correct something. A zygote is indeed alive.
Okay, I should say that.
I'm glad a biologist says here.
I should say what I should say is that certainly bacterium alive, but we don't ban Lysol. I should be more clear. Okay. I should be more clear.
Well, let me try to tackle this.
Yep.
Thank you for that question. First of all, I am not saying that there are non-overlapping spheres of thinking or of existence, and that science and faith never overlap and can never contradict one another. I don't say that. I never said that. And I don't intend that. What I say is there are differences between the ways that science and other disciplines, including religion, approach their gaining of knowledge and approach the truth. And I actually believe that there is substantial overlap between science and faith. And that there are occasions when science corrects incorrect beliefs of religious people. And so, for example, when Copernicus proposed that the Earth goes round the sun, he was proposing something which wasn't the common belief of religious people of this day, and was ultimately resisted by the Roman Church, as you say, in particular in the case of Galileo, who wanted to advocate the Copernican system. And I think that the Church was wrong. Okay, I mean, simply the Earth does go around the sun. Okay, it simply was an example of science correcting religion. But when it comes to the other way round, science says, no, you can't do that. Okay. But I think that's erroneous. I mean, I think there are many ways in which religion also can correct, constrain, or guide science. And if you do research in any American research lab, university, or wherever that receives government funding, you are obliged to observe certain moral and ethical constraints on the way you do that research, particularly in respect of biology and particularly in respect of human subjects. There are a whole list of requirements that are imposed on you by law. Now, is it wrong that we have those requirements imposed on us by law because it's inhibiting science? No. I think that's an example where science rightfully is being constrained by the ethics and morals of society, which by and large are predominantly derived from religion. So there is a certain sense in which religion is constraining and correcting science. And I certainly think it is not off the cuff obvious that a religious perspective to have something to say about issues such as stem cells, fetal stem cells, it's certainly not at all obvious to me that that is a bad position to have. I want science to be constrained by ethics and morality because I think that's extremely important. And I think that it's inevitable that religion will have something to say. So there are other aspects of the religious interaction with science which I'm much less comfortable with. But the particular example that you gave, I'm actually fairly comfortable with. Because I do think it's an example of the way that there should be a fruitful interaction between our religious and ethical systems and the way in which science is practiced.
I just want to thank you for coming today. This was very informative, and I want to say that I agree with your argument. It does seem that scientism does overstep its boundaries, and that there are other forms of knowledge that don't need to be scientific. But my questions are more about your faith in particular. You framed this talk with a Christian lens. Can I ask why you might have picked that?
Well, obviously because I'm a Christian.
Because you're a Christian. All right. That makes sense. And I'm sure a lot of us are, more than, say, Muslims. Now, Christians and Muslims, like, as a Christian, you believe Christianity is right, yet Muslims believe that Islam is right. Yet neither one of them would disagree that gravity is right, for instance. So how can you reconcile your beliefs that you are correct with theirs that they are correct? Like, what prevents them from understanding what you believe to be right?
Okay, so I think it's right, I think it's a reasonable thing to do, to point to a difference in the way that science and this is one of the wonderful things about science seems to be able to come up with much greater level of consensus about the things that it claims than, for example, religions, or for that matter, than politics, or than music, maybe most of you thought Bach, So I do think that science is wonderful from that point of view, and science is amazingly attractive to me personally, since you're asking me personal questions, precisely because I do think that we very often in science do come up with answers that are simply right, and everyone who's properly informed eventually says, yeah, that really makes sense. But I think that's partly to do with the topics and aspects of the universe that come under science's umbrella. I mean, science is trying to describe the world insofar as it is reproducible and has this clarity which allows us to understand reproducible experiments and hence to develop this consensus which we find in science. So in a certain sense, it's not a surprise that we have a terrific consensus in science, because in a certain sense, science has chosen as its topic and as part of its methods something that's going to lead to consensus areas. But the problem is a lot of our lives don't have those properties, and therefore a lot of our lives we don't have those clear consensus, and so we have political parties going at one another, and we have religious disagreements and so on and so forth. So that's kind of my explanation for why I think it is that there is kind of a difference between scientific thinking, which is not without controversy, okay, between scientific thinking and thinking of and discussion of religion or politics or many other things in life. So, thank you.
I'm in this class that's called Psychology of Consciousness, and we're learning about, we're about to start looking at neural correlates of consciousness, so basically trying to figure out what spots in the brain are trying to be looked at in research that might have the focal center of where consciousness comes from, because consciousness is found in animals, but at a much lower level than us, obviously. And we're trying to figure out what it means to have consciousness, because it's so hard to define, and basically what it means to be human. So we go through interesting exercises every day. Like one we had today was where if you had the ability to be transported anywhere on the planet for vacation, all you had to do was push a button and walk a machine, your body would be immediately destroyed and disintegrated and then reappear over there. And you would have the choice if you want to push that button, because it would still be you that's recreated, but it would be all of the atoms recreated in a new way somewhere else. So it's not your original body, and whether or not you would feel like spiritually this was a good idea to do.
You should get to the question.
Yeah. So I don't know what you think about that.
What do I think about that is the question. Yeah. I think there's a lot of very fascinating brain research going on, and our ability particularly to image what's going on in the brain has advanced tremendously, and it needs to go a lot further because it's still pretty blurry and slow responding, and there are people actually in my department at MIT who are trying to accomplish that. But it doesn't bother me that we can study the brain and we can see parts of the brain lighting up when I'm thinking different thoughts, I'm doing different actions and so forth. In fact, it would be most remarkable if that was not the case. If I think my brain has something to do with my actions as well as my thoughts, it would be surprising if there weren't some correlates of my thoughts. So what my attitude is this: yes, we are at the very beginnings of an understanding of the way that the brain correlates with thought and with mind. But even if we have a complete description of the way that the brain functions at a physical level, that's not going to mean that it rules out the idea that I have ideas. Of course I have ideas, whether or not I can explain those ideas in terms of physics and chemistry and firing of neurons and so on and so forth. So again, I come back to the view that explanation at different levels has to be simultaneously possible for us to make sense of the world. And I think that's a good example of where we have explanations at different levels.
It seems that one of the people was asking, why aren't you a Muslim or some other religion if you are only going off this philosophy of science versus religion? Why wouldn't that just lead you maybe to deism, say? And I was surprised you didn't mention something about the scripture as being self-authenticating and self-sufficient, and the testimony of the Holy Spirit in a believer's heart. And I was wondering if you could just touch on that a little.
Okay. So my own personal faith is certainly not founded in any kind of, in its entirety, on the kinds of arguments that we've been having here. That's a good point, and certainly my own experience of God in prayer, in my life, in worship and so forth, is an important aspect of what leads me to believe that my Christianity is true. But I suppose I've been emphasizing, and you're suggesting overemphasizing the intellectual aspects of it, because I think, that's what the question was really about. Is this intellectual suicide, okay? And my answer is no, it's not intellectual suicide. But of course, Christians say, that when you're a member of Christ's body, that the Holy Spirit is part of his gift to the church, that the Holy Spirit indwells the individual and brings to mind the things of Christ and leads us and so on and so forth. And this is part of what prayer and devotion means. And those things are meaningful to me. And if I were a preacher, I'd be probably preaching more about that than I would be preaching about scientism.
Okay, absolutely. Last one.
Aloha. So I was wondering, were you raised Christian? There's more to this question.
How many questions are you going to have?
It's good. Well, were you raised Christian?
I grew up in a home where Christianity was basically not practiced. My parents were not Christians. So I had no Christian commitments prior to age just before 20.
So have you brought your open-mindedness to the rest of the world's religions, and would you say there's a chance you might be completely wrong? Just an off chance? Or...
So how many more questions?
That's it. That's the whole one. Is there a chance that you might be wrong? Have you analyzed the rest of the world's religions with an open mind? Looked at them.
Yeah. Okay. So
decided?
this is coming back to the question of other religions. Okay. Of course, we in the West have, if you like, the benefit of having a Christian culture historically behind us. And I at school studied the Bible, although I actually wasn't a Christian. It was just a document that I was interested enough to study and did so in classroom situations. So I was actually sort of knowledgeable about Christianity in a way that I certainly wasn't knowledgeable about Islam, and frankly am not knowledgeable about Islam and so forth. For me personally, Christianity is what I believe in primarily because I believe in God because I believe in Jesus rather than the other way round. And what I mean by that is that what persuades me of the reality of God is in part some of the historical and other evidences of the person of Christ, the attractiveness of the person of Christ and of his teachings, and what springs from them. So to me, it really isn't even a live issue. Would I be a Muslim or would I be a Hindu and so forth? To me, Jesus Christ is the attraction rather than the other things. I don't actually think it's terribly helpful for us to do a psychological analysis of, if I'd grown up in India, I'd have been a Hindu. I don't know whether you can prove that one way or the other. And the fact of the matter is, if you're Chinese these days, or if you're African these days, you're just as likely to be a Christian as anyone else, because that's where, for example, in China, there's an amazing growth of Christianity. That's not because they have a Christian culture there. It's because Christianity is appealing to them. And maybe it is that they experience the same thing that I do, which is that the person of Jesus Christ is amazingly attractive, and that I find a reality there that draws me.
Well, that's a very nice way to end, and I think we will end now. And Dr. Hutchinson, Ian will be here for a few more minutes to chat with those of you that gather around, but let's wrap it up and express our appreciation.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.